I've taken him to Legoland. Don't know if Max has ever been, but I got Max's birthday coming up. So we don't do presents, we do experiences. So
We try to do that too.
serious possibility. Well, all 5 of mine have more than they need as far as themes are concerned.
Ours too.
And the experiences are the memories.
Yeah.
So
Ours too.
Kaylee is finally getting hers this weekend. Her birthday's in January. She wanted to go to an OU softball game.
Oh, nice.
She's the only person who asked us specifically
Or something.
which is where to go.
Yeah,
And
which is
I'm
awesome.
like, that's cool.
Yeah.
So they weren't playing softball in January.
Right.
They already were going this weekend.
Yellow. No, I think that's, I just signed it when they go.
And no, we didn't sign up like.
No, I think it's right. That's great. Well, we kind of have a running list because that's what Angela does for girls.
Hello.
And we're finally getting big enough that we can enjoy for more we were like too small for like Legoland. We were too small for the longest time. We went recently.
Cash there last year when he turned.
Yeah.
This year we did
Oh,
the
thank you.
last place.
Yeah,
street
you're good to go.
had not been to.
It's probably just not on.
I thought I.
Okay, thanks, bro.
Yeah.
There was one at Flower Mound. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, it's
Nice. She was
Not at all.
talking about it.
That's a
Well, let's look at this. For Max.
Oh, I got Laurel.
There is a height limit,
10 o'clock at night.
so we might have to check. Don't think I read it.
I'm gonna lay it down somewhere.
Pardon me? So we're going into Johannesburg and it's up there. Drive.
That to be under a certain size or something like that.
No,
My girlfriend told me before, even though age wise, they're still allowed in there. But the main area is so big back there. You may see adults.
We're gonna be there 6 hours. I'm just gonna stay in the airport. So. Like.
We love it.
Word of mouth. A
Uh,
little bit more.
well, that outdoor
Yeah,
lawn
that's what I thought.
across from
They had
the,
a fire there earlier this week. So.
London?
And Heathrow.
Justin
Oh,
in 20
they're
Justin in
closed
24.
down.
That the big outdoor.
It's not on the highway.
Shops.
Yeah,
It's
he
in
said that
shops.
a time for the lakes. Probably.
Have y'all done dino pits?
Yeah.
There's one.
Thank you.
The girls love that one.
Yeah.
It's probably too big for stuff.
So I got a lot of free time.
And
That's
then-
what I was already thinking about, man.
And then there's a new one in
Oh,
Lewis.
we landed in
Lewis,
2014.
almost like the colony, that side of it. It's a little bigger. It's got some cool stuff in there.
No, no.
Yeah.
I mean, we landed,
But-
but yeah, the power went out, but we're feeling the cars, you know, all that.
Kind of too small for a lot of things. Yeah, like
You're.
You never know.
A lot of.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
If he wants to do a.
Thank you.
then-
I already told I would be able to look up.
What's that?
Oh, yeah. We owe those two.
Oh, that's-
Trip to Brussels Rail.
Yeah, that's on our list.
Good thing that you're very. Yeah, the kids I used to live.
That was our repair
like,
Oh.
yeah,
But
he has seen, they were doing.
we were to Mono Valley. Same
One of
one.
several.
That's on our list.
So we nearly killed each other. That's right. We got bed out. I was like, "Oh, it's so nice."
And then he's gonna fix this next time, but all I.
That one is on our list. Okay, so at 7, he is big enough.
What?
Yeah. Hurts me. It's really.
Oh, yeah.
That's why you go. Yeah.
Mine is just still too slow.
He said, well, you remember Thursday, he asked.
Thankfully, in this area, we have a lot of
Are y'all
options.
gonna go here then, because they took him to a thing.
We would not have so many options in college. We would drive in Houston a lot.
The house is probably like.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is that?
Yeah.
Immediately, no, sorry.
I may, I gotta do the math, but I may just go ahead and.
You can shoot me.
YouTube and all sides.
And you.
Sides. And those are two other places we also want to land.
But it makes.
You ready?
Wow, so you like. I told them she could start in there. It's a vibe because it's so being all about we spent most of our time in this, the hydraulics room basically, shooting balls and all of this. I got it. He was too small for us at last. Yeah. Thank you. You're probably too much. They had. Oh, yeah. I know, she's gonna do great. She's gonna do great. Oh, it was too small for me. I know. And it just grass and everything, so. There was an air cannon that we could fire fast. You know, I'm always looking for. San Antonio. We went to the, this is just not Oliver, we went to the firefighters museum, he did not care a thing about anything except all the little toys they got. I was like, you just play. And then when I realized where we were, I was like, Oliver, and this is an Alamo. Take a photo. So we get there, we take the picture together, and I was like, okay, let's go. He goes, let's try to send you. We don't have to go inside. We just. I'm glad you did.
How you doing? You going to the pop? Yeah. Today is Miles player's last day here.
Oh, I
So we're gonna be thinking about that. Well, we have potluck last time. So we from 12 to 2. Make it. Be good if you can, but I know it's last minute, so. I'm going. Yeah. All right, we'll catch up.
You had it ready. You know what? With the museums in Waco has a good positive standards, like half of them. They have the Purple Museum.
All right.
You guys are, and then the Rangers Museum, if you're interested in Rangers.
One. All right, good to have everybody here. We're gonna pick up on page number 31. Actually. Page number 29, and then we'll move on to the next lesson. I'm gonna ask you, can you lead us in a prayer?
Father, we're so grateful for this day. Lives have been spared, especially that we can come together and worship you. We are grateful for so much in this life, so many physical things that we enjoy, the beauty of this earth, freedoms of this country. health and relative health that we have, the riches that we have, which are much greater than our needs. But most of all, we are thankful and grateful for the spiritual blessings through your Son, the love that you have for us and have had from even before we were born, that you would establish your church and preserve your word so we may know how to act and be pleasing to you. Be with us during this class, that we rightly divide the principles that you have set forth. We pray, dear Father, that we carry these in our life, that we be the example that we need to be to those around about us. Forgive us of our shortcomings. Make it strike our hearts so that we are penitent and ask your forgiveness. By the authority of your Son that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, bro. All right, so today we're gonna wrap up page number 29, lesson number 9, and we have a couple of more lessons to go. We have this week and then next week, and then the quarter will be completed. This will be my last class Kevin is going to teach. Thank you, Kevin. Next week, Lord willing, I'll be out in Brooklyn. There's going to be a conference out there for men who are preaching. So do some preacher training out there, and then I get an opportunity to preach there, Lord willing, this coming Sunday. So thank you guys for the great class. I think it's been fantastic. I know there's been a lot of great conversations and things I have not thought about as well. So this has been fantastic. And you know, if you have more questions along the way, please let me know. So we probably could spend 6 months studying this, but we're not going to do that. We just have a couple of more weeks left. So we talked a little bit last week about the universal and local church. I just want to wrap up this lesson here before we move on. See if this works. So on page number 29, just wrapping this up here. As we think about the local church, collective action necessitates 4 things relative to the local church. We talked a little bit about this last week. Number 1, for a local congregation, there always has to be a plurality of members. I think we all understand that. So one Christian is not a local church. All right. Even the action of a few members may not constitute the local church. And the example is found in Matthew chapter 18. If you remember in Matthew chapter 18, with respect to discipline or something with respect to sin, in Matthew chapter 18 and verse number 15, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. Is that the church acting? Yes or no? That'd be no. That's 2 brothers acting. But if he does not listen to you, take 1 or 2 more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. Is the church acting there? No, those are just individuals. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. And so we see that there's a number of steps even before the church gets involved collectively. So there has to be a plurality of saints. We understand that from passages like Philippians chapter 1 that we talked about. Let's see here. There must be an agreement to act as one. That is the nature of collective action, whether it's a church or family or a nation. Every local church has its beginning by saints mutually consenting to work together. Think about when Paul was in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19. There's going to be 12, I believe, members there who obeyed the gospel. When he's in Corinth, he's starting off with those that heard, believed, and were baptized. Number 3, there must be acceptance of common oversight for direction and guidance. And when a congregation is first established, this usually takes the form of men meeting to decide the church's business. I'm sure most of us, or at least some of us, have been a part of a local congregation. There were no elders. That's okay. Because there has to be maturity in a local congregation for men to eventually get to that point to aspire to be elders and to do that work of a elder or pastor. That should always be the goal of a local congregation. So in process of time, the Lord intends for qualified bishops to be appointed to oversee the flock. But in either case, there must be a mutual agreement on common oversight, even with that as well. And then finally, when you think about the local church, as we made some distinctions between the local and universal, there must be a pooling of means and abilities. This involves not only a collection of taking up of funds like 1 Corinthians 16, by which the local church may operate, but also combining of their non-material resources so that they may work together. We all have different talents, we all have different abilities, and all of that plays a role here at West Main, as it would in other local churches, please.
What's an example of non-material resources?
What would be an example of non-material resources? Well, just what I just said, different,
Talent?
different talents and things like that. So I think about maybe Hugh, helping young men, or Stephen helping young men to lead singing or something like that. Me, with respect to helping young men teaching and preaching. So it's not always something tangible or financial, but the different abilities that we all have to contribute. I think about Cody with his expertise in electronics and helping us out with these different aids, being able to carry out those things, Nikki. So those would be some examples of non-material resources. The other example could be just teachers, Bible class teachers, both men and women, young and old. We're pooling abilities, time, sacrifice, all of those things would fall into that category. So, to summarize, the local church involves a plurality of saints who agree to act as one under a common oversight and with a common treasury to do the work God intends them to do together as a body. Authority for a local church is found in direct statements, examples, and implication. And while the local church involves an agreement among men, it is authorized by God. It's God's intention that each saint associate himself with the local church, being accountable to it and for it. Any other questions before we move on, please?
I understand the example, but I'm interested in the definition of church in Matthew 18, since that's prior to the organization, the beginning of the church. I'm guessing even the Jewish brethren would have, this would be applicable to them, and the church for that would be the Jewish gathering. Is that correct?
My first thought is Jesus is just speaking by anticipation. Just as he did in Matthew 16 and verse 18, upon this rock, I will build my church. Says he talks about different relationships within God's people and forgiveness. That's my first thought, that he's speaking by anticipation of this is how it's going to be when that time does come. Yeah. So he first mentions that in Matthew 16 and verse 18, and so that'd be my first answer. Making this preparatory thoughts and comments before it actually. All right, any other questions? Good question.
I do have.
Okay.
This question has been posed to me several times, and I really need to be able to explain. Even though I understand it, but sometimes it's hard for me to put it in words. So when we use 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, for our example, as taking up a weekly collection. Weekly, because it says on the first day of the week, this is what we're. Let me not add here. Yeah, so it says in verse 2, on the first day of the week, let each of you lay aside something. The question comes up to me, but this was for a specific purpose. This collection was for, they collected, and then that money was dispersed to churches who were in need. So, why do we collect every Sunday then if we're not actively? She finds out, I'm like, well, we have a church, but we have things that we have to pay for. But sometimes I feel like that's not always, that's not a good enough example. I need to be able to say, no, well, okay, we have an example for it. But that money is not always, we're not gonna collect every Sunday and say, all right, we have 15,000 that need to go out the door and this church over here needs it, this church over here needs it. Why did we not disperse it to individual churches? I've had this asked to me many times, particularly people in my family, so that gets a
Yeah.
little.
That's a great question and the perfect segue into the next lesson. Turn over to page number 31. And we'll just jump here right into this, because sometimes Nikki, people do have questions about that. This lesson is really all about the reality of the local church as an entity, right? It is something that is real. It is something that exists. It still exists, even if we're not here on the first day of the week, very much like Congress is still Congress, even though they may not be assembled every single day. And the premise or the purpose of this lesson is really to help us to understand that, that we use the language, I'm going to church and things like that, but understanding, that we're a part of the body. And so understanding that there is such a thing as a local church. One of the ways to understand this, and Nikki, let's just start in point number 3 for all of us, and I'll answer your question. With respect to monetary matters, number 1, a local church may pay wages. By that to a local preacher, right? 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Let's just read these verses here. There are other passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul talks about a man who preaches the gospel can live by the gospel. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse number 8, Paul said, I robbed other churches, not literally or something sinful, by taking wages from them to serve you. One of the reasons why the Corinthians were upset with Paul is because he had refused to take money from them. And you had these what's called sophists, these people who would go around teaching and preaching and for their own profit and their own gain. And so Paul would sometimes take wages, sometimes he wouldn't. But here we see that he's taken wages from other churches to help serve them. So number 1, a local church may pay wages. The group functioned as one, pooling their money and supporting Paul. One of the best examples is the church in Philippi, like in Philippians chapter 4. B, the fact that a local church has dealings with money, receiving and dispersing, we're going to all contribute if we have something that we have already laid aside, if we have not already done that. And it shows a local church may have a treasury. Saints in the New Testament acted as one through a common treasury. In Acts chapter 4, the early Christians, let's just read that as well. And this actually goes back to Acts chapter 2, but we know that they were they had one heart, one soul in Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4, beginning in verse 32. And the congregation of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and not one of them claimed that anything belonging to him was his own, but all things were common property to them. So they were willing to share what they had for the sake of other needy Christians. And with great power, the apostles were given testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and abundant grace was upon them all. For there was not a needy person among them, for all who were owners of land or houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to each as any had need. Well, when they laid them at the apostles' feet, was that now the apostles' personal funds? No, but there was a pooling of financial means, a treasury, okay? Why did Ananias and Sapphira get in trouble? Not just trouble, but punished through death in Acts chapter 5? What was behind that?
Because they lied, they wanted to present themselves as something.
That's exactly right. Yeah, they lied, they were presenting themselves in a different way. Peter would make it clear when it was their money and in their control, they could do whatever they wanted, right? So there's like this clear separation. When it's in our hands, when it was in their hands, they could do whatever they wanted. But now when it's given over, now something has changed. And that's what we see here with the local treasury. When we take up a collection today, in the middle of worship services, well, that's going to go into the local treasury here at West Main. Go ahead.
No, I just had a question for Nikki, like.
Oh, hold that thought before we get to that. Hold that thought, so we don't have multiple questions. All right. So the money was laid at the apostles' feet in Acts chapter 4. When Peter and John went to the temple in Acts 3 and performed a miracle, with the man who was lame, said, silver and gold have I none. So the money did not belong to the apostles, but to the group. It was to be used only for those purposes that were consistent with the group's function. All right, and that goes back to the beginning of the church in Acts chapter 2. Once the money was given, it was no longer in control of the giver. That's what we see in Acts 5. So a church from its treasury may send funds to a preacher. We do that both locally. My salary, it comes from the local treasury here, right? We do that also abroad with preachers in Africa, in India, and in other places as well. A church was commanded to assemble, so now we're going back to 1 Corinthians 16, Nikki, a collection. And we know that there was a collection for those saints that were in need, and Paul's gonna have to follow them a year later in 2 Corinthians to tell them to hurry up and finish what he promised to do. The same local church controlled those funds, according to 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 3. So here's your answer, Nikki. It's been argued this giving was for a special purpose. All giving is for a special purpose. That's how I'm going to answer that question. All giving is for a special purpose, because every week there is some need that we have here in this local congregation for things to continue on here. So sometimes people make the argument, well, we should only give if there's some big need, but every week there's some kind of need that needs to be met or covered. When you think about that argumentation as well, and then Kevin, I see your hand. The Corinthians were able to help others, like another congregation, we'll look at that in another lesson, because they actually had a supply. They actually had a surplus, so they were able to help those who were actually in want. And so there's a special purpose every week when it comes to giving, whether it's a preacher's salary. And it gets a little awkward talking about this since I'm the preacher and my salary, or Miles's salary, but we'll talk about it anyway, or supporting men overseas. There's a weekly need. And so all giving, I think, can be said for a special purpose. Now, there may be some particular moments where there isn't another big need. Hurricane Harvey, for example, back in 2017. But the work assigned by God to the local church, Nikki, regulates the purpose for our giving. There's constant work that's taking place here, which also requires giving on a regular basis. That's my answer. That's how I explain it.
In order to back up that responsibility of others, even though this is for a specific purpose in 1 Corinthians 16, we can still use this verse for that?
Yeah, absolutely. On the first day of every week, absolutely. But you also have to look at what's the work that we're doing here locally. We're doing a work here that requires a consistent giving. And so it's not just merely for some emergency, but there has to be some kind of treasury or pooling of funds and resources for the local work to continue here. That's how I would answer it, Kevin.
Yeah, you just touched on it, right? So it's the first day of every week. That's the command. That's the example given. We were laid by a store. It gives us the authority to store up, whether we put that into a bank account or some other method, right? That we deemed appropriate. So that's something we do every week. There is a specific activity going on, but if you go back to Galatians chapter 2, you remember Peter told Paul to remember the poor and the saints of Jerusalem. So as he was doing his work, he was requesting funds for the brethren as an act of benevolence in Jerusalem. But that's not the only thing. But like you mentioned, that's not the only thing that's going on in the church, right?
Yeah.
This was a specific activity, but it's something we do every week.
That's
right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, and you just brought a couple of things to my attention as well. Nikki, I think this may be able to help you out if you have this conversation again. Secondly, 1 Timothy chapter 5, we have authority, a local church has authority to support financially elders. A local church has authority to support financially elders. There would be some in the first century in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and that's something that men who serve as elders, they have to make that decision, and a local congregation has to make that decision. Some churches, the elder may do most of the teaching and preaching, right? In fact, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, there's instructions at verse 17, the elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. There are some men in our brotherhood who's the evangelist and also one of the elders. That's an appropriate role as well. And so could elders be put on a financial role? I believe so, right? If they so chose to. Not only that, and then I'll come to you, Tanya, but in 1 Timothy chapter 5, there were widows in the first century that were also put on a roll. That's a weekly necessity. So you see how that works now? There's evangelists, there's widows, there's elders, there's the poor, there's any means with respect to facilities, right? So there's a reason why there is a weekly contribution with that time.
Nick, my question was like, what's behind their question? Do they not want to give weekly? Do they go somewhere where they give monthly? I'm just curious about.
No, it's a weekly thing. It's a weekly thing.
But
They
they're
just question why we always go to a particular verse like that particular verse. When there's other verses that. They feel like there are other verses that can be used and not just 1 Corinthians 16:1-2.
Sure.
When
Well,
it
yeah, I'm-
specifically says, okay, well, this gift is going to be taken to this
Sure.
particular area.
Gotcha.
But that's when they met.
That's when they met. That's
They met on
exactly
the
right.
first day.
Yeah, and that's the most logical time
So
to.
everyone
Yeah.
would have an opportunity.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so don't discount 1 Corinthians 16, even though somebody says, why not go to another verse? They may not even understand 1 Corinthians 16, in all honesty. With that said, if somebody's asking about a need, and I've heard this argument when I was in Rockford, Illinois, I was still in sales and trying to figure out what preaching was. I didn't fully understand it, but I can remember, brother, he didn't believe that a local man could be supported financially. Or a preacher should be supported financially. So, well, you have 1 Corinthians chapter 9, you have 2 Corinthians, you just read chapter 11, you have Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15. Crystal and then Joanna.
Just an observation for me.
Okay.
And valuable for me, that in God's wisdom, how He set up the church. Because you see, denominations, they patronize the world to support them. Okay, there's no example of this happening in the Lord's church. It is the saints that have to support the saints and the work of the church. We can't do car washes, we can't do random donations to help anything to do with the Lord's church.
Exactly, and I'll add one thought, excellent point, I got some of those newspaper clippings from years ago, those things are still happening today. Some brethren have had the view as well, once I give on the first day of the week, then my responsibility is done. Well, you still have passages like Galatians chapter 5, do good unto all men, especially those of the household of faith. There's an individual responsibility for us to do good. James chapter 1 with the widows and the poor in verse 27, there's an individual responsibility. That's why there's a distinction in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Widows who are truly widows indeed, the church can support them. But if you're a believing brother or sister, no, you need to support the widow in your family before the church ever gets involved from a financial standpoint, right? So widows need to understand that, children need to understand that, and you're exactly right. From the genesis of the church, there is a giving, a sacrificial mindset of the Christians. That's what they did, and that would have an impact upon the Roman Empire because they saw how giving they were. So Dorcas, she didn't put her coats up for sale on eBay or anything like that, or any other website. She just made them out of the goodness of her heart. So I'm sure she lost some money, but she was laying up treasures. Joanna?
I would just say, this specific purpose, we've committed as a church to support I don't know what the number is now, the 30 or so men around the world. We've set that as our purpose, and that is our weekly purpose, is to fund those preachers across the world. Now, we have some other bills we have to pay,
That's right.
but that is our specific purpose. And sometimes we change who those men are, or, and sometimes they are, when they become self-sufficient in their group, that is usually when we change how we support, right? If their own local congregation can support them, then we say, great, that's great, we're gonna now find someone else who needs help in that way. But as individuals, you know, Dorcas can make clothes all day long and give them to, and as an individual, she can do that good and hand out the clothes to the saints or send them to saints as she needed.
That's right.
It didn't have to be money.
That's right.
She had her talent.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Paul was going to provide for Onesimus, if I remember correctly, if he owed Philemon something, I'll provide for him, right? That would be out of his own pocket. That's appropriate, right? So there's a lot of great lessons to take away, both individual. That's why the lesson next week, lesson 12, the church or the individual in the church. We still can do good, not just on Sunday mornings when we give, but there's so many opportunities. By the way, it's not just about money. It's about time, studying, resources, right? Availability. There's so many different ways that we can support one another. Excellent thoughts. Any other comments, suggestions? Okay. Does that help?
Very helpful.
Okay.
I will ask you at home about 2 Corinthians chapter 8.
Okay. All right. You sure you don't want to ask me now?
I'm not sure.
Okay, then we'll move on then. You're not sure, all right. I remember years ago when I was at Down Road, somebody asked me about 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 8. How could Paul rob other churches? Well, he didn't do it literally. That may not be yours. I'm just saying sometimes.
I said 2 Corinthians chapter 8.
Chapter 8, gotcha. Okay. All right. Did a sermon on that years ago. Need to get that outline. Okay, well, let's look at lesson number 10. We're already halfway through. Because we've already looked at the local church as a entity. It is something that exists. It is something that we are a part of. Look at point number 1 here. And we'll just spend a few more minutes unless you guys, let me ask you guys this question. Are there any questions from lesson number 10? Or any thoughts from lesson number 10? Okay. Point 1, with respect to the terms used to describe it. New Testament saints, the people of God, function collectively and are treated as an entity. That's what this whole lesson is about. That entity is a local church. So the terms used to describe the local church are collective nouns. Collective noun treats a plurality of persons grouped together as one. Team is an example. What's some other examples of a collective noun? Team, what'd you say?
Team.
Team, what other ones?
Think of a chain, links, and a chain. Each collective is a chain.
There you go. All right, any other ones?
Understand it.
Flock, think about the animal kingdom, right? There's a lot of different ways that we can describe it. So the word ecclesia, from which church is translated, is a collective noun. When the Bible speaks of the church of God, which is at Corinth, 1 Corinthians 1-2, it's speaking of a group, speaking of a collectivity of the saints in that place. Point C, flock is a collective noun used to describe a local church. Peter was one of the elders in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse number 2. Let's turn over there and read that. 1 Peter 5, actually we'll start at verse number 1. But the idea here is Peter says, shepherd the flock of God. That's a plurality of people. And he's using this to describe a local church. 1 Peter 5 verse 1, therefore I exhort the elders among you, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness. The same is found in Acts chapter 20 and verse number 28. So there are other collective nouns that are used to describe the local church, but these are just some examples. Pointing to this idea that it is an entity, all right? With respect to the various servants that it has, when a church is spoken of as having overseers, the language shows it's a functioning unit. They have to be overseers of a group of people. Local churches in the New Testament have special servants. Philippians chapter 1, we have bishops, we have deacons. Acts chapter 6, those servants, those 7 men that were appointed, my understanding, those would be deacons. I think that's the role that they're playing as these deacons. Romans chapter 16, verse 1 and 2. Phoebe is mentioned. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1 and 2. And she is described as a what?
Depends on your translator.
You can depend upon the how it's translated. I'm reading from the New American. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church, which is at Centuria, that you receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints. She may have been carrying Paul's letter, I don't know. And that you help her in whatever matter she may have need of you, for she herself, Romans 16, verse 2, has also been a helper of many and of myself as well. There are women that helped Jesus. If you remember back in Luke chapter 8, verses 1, 2, and 3. And now we have a sister, Phoebe, who's a servant. Some translations will say deaconess, right? It's the idea of a servant. How do we answer that question? Can women be deacons? Well, 1 Timothy chapter 3 will modify our understanding of that particular office in a local congregation. But nonetheless, she was a servant of God, not in an official office. How many deacons do we have in here? We got one deacon in here. So not in the same sense that Matthew is one of our deacons, right? Who's been appointed by the elders to serve here in this local congregation. But make no mistake about it, she's doing a lot of great work. And there are also others who could be described as messengers. Epaphroditus, I'm probably pronouncing his name correctly, in Philippians chapter 2. He would go out and help that church in Philippi. He's assisting them. So there's a lot of different roles and opportunities for brethren. Sometimes people get upset, well, there should be more opportunities for sisters in the church. They should be preaching and should be elders. No, they should not, because you don't have authority for it. All right. So this isn't a numbers game or, just trying to please please people in the 21st century. And sisters have to understand this just as men do. Make no mistake about it, though, sisters play a vital role in this local church. Think about all the activities that our sisters are helping behind the scenes. Now, Phoebe was evidently well known. I mean, they know her, and she's helping Paul in some capacity, which is okay. The point of this point was with respect to the various servants. We can see again that a local church indeed is an entity. Yeah, question or comments?
For the men in Act 6, fulfilling the role of deacon, like the office of deacon, or were they just given a special job? Men given an assignment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my understanding would be that they were fulfilling that role of as deacons. They're serving, the apostles are not serving tables, they're going to serve the tables. The apostles in verse 4 are going to devote themselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. If somebody argues and says, well, it doesn't say they officially had this office, I don't know how much more closer a person can get to or an example can be of what deacons and the role of deacons are. So that's how I explain it. And that's my understanding of it. They're appointed, there's 7 men. That would be sufficient for the work. That's an interesting thought too. With the widows who were being neglected in Jerusalem, it was going to be sufficient with these 7 men who were going to be chosen, right? But there's agreement with that as well. If some say, well, I don't think that's the official office of a deacon, all right, but they're serving, they're ministering, they're taking care of a particular issue. I like to describe deacons like the nuts and bolts of a congregation. I think somebody else has described them in that manner as well. When there is a particular need or service, that's why you have deacons. So you have the number of deacons that are needed to fulfill a particular amount of work. If you think about elders, most congregations are going to need more elders, right? But with deacons, when there's a need that arises, then okay, let's see if there's some men that can help resolve that. Stephen, any comments on Act 6 and this office of a deacon or role here that you want to share? Again, that's my understanding of it, that this would be
I mean, as far as,
Go ahead.
It is a unique situation.
It is.
That they were appointed by apostles, they were laying on of hands, there was a very interest period in the early church, and so I probably wouldn't invite anybody over, but at the same time, they were appointed physical, so that physical need. But they were given also gifts of the Holy Spirit by laying on hands, and Philip goes on to basically preacher.
Evangelists.
Yeah. And so it's, I think it's unique, I would say, but I also would argue.
Stephen?
Yeah, I
Councilor
certainly wouldn't argue over it either. I mean, you know, it does appear that they could have been considered deacons in that role. But whether they were or not, it doesn't discredit the idea that deacons do have a place in the congregation.
Yeah.
And there are qualifications and there is a role designated to that. So whether they were or not, doesn't change the outcome.
The other thing to say is that if they weren't, what does that, what impact?
Zero.
No, zero.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Kevin? And then.
Yeah, I think it's circumstantial. It'd be just like today, right? Can the elders ask a man that is not a deacon and assign him work to do?
Yeah,
Right.
we do all the time.
Happens all the time,
Everyone else.
right? So that's the point. So, yeah, I mean, I agree. I wouldn't argue over it either way, right? But a good point. Good points that are made.
Yeah, Krista? Can we have deacons without elders in our congregation? What a great question. The fact that we have 2 elders in this class. I will submit to them. Stephen, I'll answer it, but then I want to hear from the elders here. It would seem a little bit odd. Could we? I guess we could, but it would seem a little bit odd in my eyes that there would be deacons before elders. And I think with everything that was just said, there are plenty of brethren who can still do have certain responsibilities and things like that. In my mind, I've always envisioned it as if I were to start a new work or be a part of a congregation that's starting a new work, the number one thing to get established would be elders. We need to work on 2 men who aspire to be elders, who are on board, that the congregation is in agreement with to submit to. So could they? I guess they could. I'm hesitant to say, yeah, I think that's a good idea, if I'm just being honest with that. So my first thought would be, there are still congregations with no elders. I think that's a major problem. You know, the congregation's around for 20, 30 years, no elders. My first thought is, do the men not want to relinquish some kind of control? Some brethren can be like that. We don't want anybody to tell us officially or that we'll officially have to submit to. So I'm open to being persuaded. Stephen, what do you think?
I was just gonna mention, you know, our brethren here in Flower Mound that they listed to Cristo there, appointed elders recently. It's taken them many, many years because the culture among our brethren who are Spanish speaking was that they did not want to have that authority.
That's exactly right.
And it really, and Ernesto preached on it. Oh, he said, I can't remember how many times. He said like for a year. I mean, just over and over. Like, we're so tired of hearing about this. Well, once you start understanding, I'll stop preaching about it, but you guys will not give it up.
Yeah.
We have men that are qualified, and why they're not serving, I cannot understand.
Yeah.
So it's just, you know, that is part of it. But to your question about deacons, it'd be very difficult to have works that were not overseen. So if you have someone and given an office that would be overseen by an office of an elder, I think you're asking for problems.
Yeah.
And it's kind of out of order. It doesn't make sense to me logically that you'd have we're gonna appoint the deacon over this work. Who is overseeing that work? It's almost like you've kind of subverted the work of the elder and given to the deacon. That's just that's my.
Yeah,
take.
yeah.
I don't know.
Steve, what do you think?
I think that is probably the best point, is that if they're doing the work that is supervised, it's out of who are they then according to the account. It's out of just
Yeah.
feel.
Yeah.
In First Timothy, and I don't think this is necessarily authority for this way, but it talks about always being one first. But
There is an emphasis in Acts 14:23. Paul and Barnabas are going back and appointing elders, you know, in all the churches. So that seems to be priority number one with that. Also think about this, when you have an elder, or it could be both elders or however many there are, they can teach and preach, right? So there's an opportunity for elders. Some churches may say, well, we can't afford a full-time evangelist, or we don't know of a man who's gonna be able to preach every week. Well, elders can do that as well. That's 1 Timothy chapter 5, teaching and preaching. Is it wrong to have a located evangelist? No, because Paul was located in multiple places at multiple times. I'm just saying though, the emphasis seems to be first on elders. That would be my recommendation if a church asks me, hey, what do you think about this? Because you can have what Kevin said, you know, you're one of the men that you're not in an official office as a deacon. That doesn't mean that men can't work and do things, right? Whose hand I saw, Kevin and Nikki.
No, I was just thinking of Titus, right? As we think about order things, what did Paul tell Titus? Titus, he left him in Crete that you should set in order the things that are wanting and ordain elders in every city. So I think about some of the things that Stephen mentioned. It's the order, it's the way it should be, right? And I think, you know, we got the qualifications, you got the elder first, you got the deacon to set in order all things, appointing elders in all things, and being under the supervision of an eldership. I think it'd be hard to have deacons without that.
What's the biggest danger of a local church today? What's the biggest danger with a local congregation?
Error.
Error, right? That's Acts 20 verse 28. Hey, elders, we'll be on the watch out, be on the lookout, right? So first things first, right? 7 habits of highly effective people. First things first, right? Let's get the sheep, let's get the shepherds, because the sheep can just kind of wander astray. Members can do those tasks. Nikki?
So going back to Acts chapter 6, I feel like from birth, I've heard this from the pulpit, like, this is it. This is one of our examples of, you know, first deacons, Acts chapter 6. I never argued with them, I still don't. But I often wondered, well, I mean, there's some example here, it just sounds like they said, hey, to everybody, find these particular men so that they can help over this particular issue and serve this. And then I'm like, you know, we don't know if any of these men were married or not. Like, I know where the qualifications are but we don't know if any of them were married. It doesn't say. It's just,
Philip was, he had 3 daughters.
okay, Philip, the other 6.
Yeah.
We do
They're
not-
prophetess. Yeah.
we do not know the rest of them.
The
We're
plot
married.
thickens. Yeah, that's right. That's true. Well, I think what everybody has said on this Act 6, I think that's a good way to approach it. It certainly looks like the work of what deacons would do. Don't have to be dogmatic about it, for sure. We know that Philip, an evangelist, by the way, could be a deacon as well. You know, some people don't like multiple roles by one man. But Philip, he's serving here, and then he also becomes an evangelist. You and then Stu.
Especially in the early growth of a church,
Yeah.
there's still work to be done.
There's still work.
And
to be done.
somebody's gotta do it,
Yeah,
whether it's secure a contract on renting a building
Yeah.
or mowing the yard or
and whether you have a
ordering
title or not.
material, whether
Yeah.
there's a title or not,
That's
there's
right.
work to be done. And like you mentioned earlier, these are these other things that can be done by other people.
That's right.
The work still has to be done.
Amen. Stu?
Again, kind of back to the unique situation in Act 6. They were all very early in the church, right?
That's right.
1,000 of them
Thousands.
with you know, no experience, no maturity, no wisdom. And then you have the apostles who obviously had spiritual gifts and maturity and wisdom that was given to them by the Spirit. By the time you get to Acts 15, though, Paul and Barnabas actually go to meet the apostles and the elders. So some years later, even in Jerusalem, they saw the wisdom of elders. And what point that happened? Even there is that holy, is the order that was given. That's right.
Yeah, that's a great point. It appears that in the first century, elders were appointed much faster than elders are today. I mean, Acts 14, they're going circling back around to where they've already attended or started churches and they're appointing elders. probably the biggest challenge today, and you just mentioned it with the work in Flower Mound. Men who aspire the office. Plenty of men who are qualified, but it's men who aspire this work. That's what we gotta start thinking about with the new generation coming up, right? The young kids, with preachers. I texted Mark Roberts. I said, hey man, thank you so much. Today is Miles' last sermon. I appreciate what Mark has done, giving him opportunities over there to preach and the preacher conference that he attended and things like that. And he was really appreciative of the work that we've done here, the brethren, with what we've done. It's like there are preachers that are needed. And so West Main has done something good, and we need more preachers. We need more elders. But yeah, I think you're right. Again, that's still got to be number one. You got to have someone protecting the flock. And a lot of churches just go down this path where they never appoint any men. And that is disaster. Tanya and Joanna, we got time.
Yeah, it's, you just kind of spoken to that. I think every congregation we attended in Chicago, but one had no elders.
It's a lack of leadership.
They had 20+ deacons. The one we were at the longest has probably been around 40+ years. So I always wonder,
Yeah.
why do we have no elders?
Yeah.
But I also feel like that head minister at the time served both. And maybe to some of the comments that have been made, you don't really want oversight. That could be why.
There's
'Cause we did a
danger.
lot of things there that I now know,
Right.
know authority.
Yeah, there's danger with sometimes culturally, maybe there's a misunderstanding sometimes with aspirations of that office. A lot of men just say, I don't want to do it, right? And a lot of men don't want to preach. I'll preach a sermon, but I'm not gonna do this like full time. So that's something that you see that in a lot of churches. And I do think sometimes there's a power issue. I'm in control, and that can happen with certain guys, with certain preachers, right? I'm gonna run the show. That's not biblical. Joanna?
That's actually, it's like that floating Christian argument. Only the Lord knows where the line is crossed. But our goal is to do the best we can as quickly as we can.
Yeah,
But the Lord knows the hearts of people involved and knows if you really don't have qualified elders or if you just don't want to.
that's right. That's right. That's right. Stu, you got the last word.
Early throughout my life, has been at various congregations that didn't have. There were times where they liked the chaos. And
Yeah.
thought and the
That's crazy.
And but then have someone
Yeah.
without being involved.
Yeah, that's sad. That's sad. There's a lot on the line. Thank you, guys. Oh,
I'm
Kevin?
just gonna say that just points to when you think about the power struggle aspect of it. I mean, that's why there's certain qualifications for elder, right?
You
To
had,
rule and not lord it over the congregation. You have a bunch of deacons or an evangelist running around thinking that they're making all the decisions.
right,
But that's not the way the Lord structured the body. They're
well, I'll say this.
unadvisable.
I'll say this too, 'cause I've seen this as well. Churches should not rush into just appointing deacons either. Read those qualifications in 1 Timothy 3. Those are serious qualifications. So it's more than just who's gonna vacuum or change the lights. It is a serious office and damage can be done, and so there has to be wisdom with that. But there can't be so much fear that we never appoint anybody. We're not moving anywhere, right? But there has to be that wisdom with that. Excellent class. Thank you for this quarter. Thank you for all your questions. I know Kevin's gonna do a great job next week, so I'll let Kevin. Everybody look at lesson 11 and 12. Take a look at both lessons, and then maybe you can jump back and forth. We'll get through. Yeah, thank you, guys. Maybe not, yeah. Okay. It's okay if you don't. All right. They're over. More likely not, too. More likely not. Yeah. All right. Tyler, that makes sense. Cars makes sense to me. Some of that food. I'm like, what is on? You know, false out. Oh, that's all right. That's all right. Yeah, that's okay. That's all right. I'm happy you're here. You got your Bible. That's the most important thing. Bible's always the most important. Great. It's called, Blue Letter Bible?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
I've been using that a lot lately.
Okay, good.
That's been very.
Good, good.
You got a nice. She knows where to find that.
It's awesome.
Talk to me.
It's a lot of it. I know.
So there are a lot of things Anders will do, but go against mommy, I do not want you to join them first. I was like, I should not go. If it fell, yeah. I was like.
So the theory that I'm seeing. The theory. Then I never know. I don't know.